Morning and thank you for watching Eye on New Mexico. This morning we will be zeroing in on a big problem in our state and really every state: distracted driving. KOB will be airing a special program devoted to this problem later this week, and joining me this morning to talk about that, the producer of the documentary we will be airing, that documentary Driven to Distraction. Chris Schuler produced that. Thank you for being here, Chris.
Thanks for having us.
And Bill Shuttleworth, a neuroscientist with UNM's Health Sciences Center. Thank you so much for being here, Bill.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, we'll be talking about this documentary, Driven to Distraction, that premiered last week at the Chemo Theater, and we want to show you a quick clip from it.
Your odds of having a motor vehicle accident are 3 times greater if you look for more than 2 seconds off the road.
An average text message is about 4.6 seconds.
Wow, and again, that documentary is going to air on KOB this Thursday night, June 5th from 7 to 8 p.m. We'll have the documentary, and then after that, a live program in our studio talking to experts, parents, and some young drivers about this. Now, this is a problem that goes beyond just young drivers, but let's start by talking about the youth, Chris, because you do a lot of these documentaries with Safe Teen New Mexico, and this was the issue that kind of came up this year. Is that right?
Yeah, we talk to kids all over the state and get their ideas for what's coming ahead. So we try to stay ahead of the ball game and what are kind of the issues. And they're all talking about everybody uses cell phones. Everybody uses cell phones. I mean, certainly we all do. But kids in particular are attached to their cell phones. And what does that mean in terms of their driving? Well, we all know that cell phones and driving don't go together. Hands-free and handheld, identical impairment, just as if you were driving drunk. Texting is off the charts, 26 times more likely to have a crash if you're texting and driving. And they said this is a huge issue among their peers. And I think we're seeing it more and more in the newspapers now. We're seeing it, I mean, I think it's happening a lot more than is being reported because nobody says, yeah, I was texting or I was driving. These things happen.
Talking about that, that may be underreported, how do we get statistics on this? Because I know some of the stats that you pointed out in the documentary, that 11 teenagers dying every day. From this.
And it's, you know, it's really hard to get the statistics. We did it, we looked at national stuff, we looked at in the state, and the Department of Transportation has helped us a little bit with some of the funding for the show. And we said, what are the stats? And they said, you know, we're having trouble finding them. And so, but right now, and this is very interesting, we make a point of it in the show, when people are in crashes, right now, they're starting to subpoena the cell phones. They will take the cell phone from the scene, tag it into evidence, subpoena it, and then they'll check to see, okay, were you on the phone while you were driving? People have to understand that, because more and more that's becoming an issue. The insurance companies are going after people civilly and criminally, so it's a big deal. So the stats are going to start increasing. We're going to see it more and more, but we all know. I mean, 5 years ago, I think you remember we did the crash show 5 years ago. We were filming. We could not find people on their cell phones.
Just out shooting
we
video
were out
of people
filming,
in cars.
you know, looking for people in cars because that was going to be part of the show, right? And it was a little section of it. 5 years ago. Today, and we all know this, you pull up to any stop sign. There's people all around us on their phones. And it's scary stuff when you see what happens in the brain. Yeah,
it absolutely is scary. Talking a little bit about that brain aspect of it, again, Bill Shuttleworth is a neuroscientist with UNM's Health Sciences Center. And Bill, teenagers in particular have some issues with this potentially because of the way their brain hasn't fully developed yet. Is that right?
Sure. So we got a group of people together to work with Chris to sort of talk about all of these aspects that are involved. And there are a lot of things that are coming together that really affect the ability to not just learn to drive, but to learn to deal with these distractions. And one of the things that came up quite strongly was this idea that the adolescent brain in particular is really a work in progress. So there's a lot of potential, but there's also things that aren't quite finished yet, and that's very important because at this time in your life, you're developing a lot of things that connect important control parts of the brain to how to execute things like driving. So one of the things that came up was this big new body of research that really shines a light on how well connected the brain is with white matter tracks, and that's just a term that means the fast connections between different parts of the brain. The adolescent brain is going through a period of a lot of development of those tracks, which means that communication and coordination is a little bit slower. And I think that's one of the very nice things that Chris has done with this movie. He's really played up this point of timing in the brain. And that's one of the things that came up in our discussions in the adolescent brain. Timing is everything, and it's a little bit slower for some of these control centers.
And that timing is everything, as that clip pointed out. You're looking down at a text or at your phone when you're using it for an average of 4.6 seconds, but a crash will happen faster than that. Is that right?
Right,
Yeah.
and there's a very good section in the documentary talking about attention and the ability to overload the brain and actually become functionally blind for small periods of time. So during that time of texting, when you're attending to other things, when there's a lot of processing going on, you're unable to physically see or perceive things that are happening around you. And Andy Mayer in the documentary describes that very, very nicely. And I think that's a very important point, that you can overload and you're just not aware of some of the things that are going on.
And that would go beyond just teenagers. That would go for all of us.
Absolutely.
You bet.
But I think the issue with teenagers is that issue of connectivity, but also how you're still learning how to do this stuff. And that's a little bit different from an experienced driver.
Sure.
And it's something that's hard sometimes for a teenager to appreciate, that they're not going to be already brilliant at doing the stuff without distraction. And I think in our discussions with teenagers about how the brain is put together, I think it's very empowering and interesting for teenagers to recognize that the brain is not a plug-and-play device. It's actually something that's being developed really quite dramatically through these teenage years.
Yeah, into their 20s even, right?
Exactly. So this whole period of learning how to drive without any distraction is hard enough. And without all those experiences of different situations and different environments that you're driving in, all of that needs to be laid down and connected up, and that's happening in the teenage brain.
Yeah, that's incredible. I had a rear-end crash when I was 16, the first year that I had my license, and just rear-ended someone in stop-and-go traffic. I'm sure I was talking to some other people in the car and didn't look up fast enough. Not a serious crash, fortunately, but to imagine if we had had cell phones back then, and being on the phone, I can only imagine what that first year or first few years of driving might have looked like.
And the first year is the most dangerous time for any kid to drive. The very first year, and all the insurance, you look at the insurance tables, that's when it's most expensive, because the first year is the big problem.
So Chris, obviously teenagers are talking about this, what we talked about with Safety New Mexico, but do teens realize how dangerous this is? Because there was an interesting statistic you pointed out about a Facebook survey that kind of asked teens about their perception of texting and driving and how dangerous it is. Tell us about that.
Well, it's interesting because the teens we talk to do understand it, obviously. And when they see things like this, they say, oh yeah, this is a big problem. The big issue becomes how do you stop doing it? I mean, think of yourself. You've got your cell phone.
Yeah.
I won't ask you the critical question, but the statistics say 75% of people answer their cell phones when they're driving.
And I'll admit it. I
we all
absolutely
do that, right?
have answered my phone.
As soon as you do that, your chance of a crash jumps up significantly. So, and with kids who have had cell phones their entire life, as you pointed out, we haven't. We're digital immigrants. They're digital natives. They've had them their entire life. How do they put them away? So we've had a lot of conversations with kids about how they can put them away. And they're having conversations with adults. Our hope is with the show that these conversations will start and they'll understand it. When I speak to, I got off your question, I'll come back to it.
No, that's okay.
But when we speak to adults, I speak to a lot of adults groups about this for this show. And I say, how many of you, if you saw your kid, you look out the window and you see your kid pull into the driveway and they got a beer in their hand while they're driving, what would you do? Exactly.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be driving anymore, would take the keys away, you'd be grounded for life, Same situation, what would you do? Your kid drives in and he's got his cell phone in his hand. I'd tell him he probably shouldn't do that.
Interesting.
Because we all do it.
Yeah.
It's just as dangerous.
Right.
It's just as dangerous as Dr. David Strayer from Utah pointed out. He said, it's the new distraction. I mean, there's DWI, but there's all this stuff going on with cell phones and all these other things in the car. They're just as distracting. Yeah. So it's a big deal. So getting back to your question, the survey that was done and some of the statistics that we use, it's more about they will answer their cell phone, and then how many of them think that it's not dangerous. It doesn't change their behavior when they drive, and it's over 50%. I mean, most of the young people think probably, as you get older, you kind of realize it does affect it. But there's really three things with these distractions. One is hands on the wheel, one is eyes on the road, and one is, as Bill mentioned, attending to what's going on. We've all been in situations where we go, wow, I missed that exit.
Yeah,
you know?
Because you weren't thinking. Exactly.
And as Madeline points out in the documentary, if you hear your phone ring, your attention's gone for a few milliseconds. That could be just enough. Somebody runs out in the road.
Oh yeah. Yeah, very scary. And you know, kind of what you were talking about there with the beer in the hand. Kids don't usually see, most of them at least, don't see their parents driving drunk. Most of them don't see their parents driving with beers, but they do see their parents with their phones in hand. Yes,
I think it's over 90% have seen their parents drive and talk on the cell phone. And over, I think it's over 50% have seen their parents texting and driving. And then you look at the numbers, and the kids' behavior mirrors their parents' behavior. The parents are the best teachers, really. And so we've got to figure out how to get rid of the cell phones. I mean, how do we do that? Which is what the Facebook page is going to be all about that night, on the night of the show. We have questions on there. We want people to go to the Facebook and give us ideas and talk about it. We're going to talk about it on the show. NM Distractions on our Facebook page.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little more about how adults do this too, because I'll fully out admit I have texted and driven at the same time. It's terrible. I feel horrible about doing it. I finally having kids, and yeah, absolutely. And having kids, I could tell myself, okay, I won't do it when they're in the car. And so at least there's that, where I said to myself, never would I do this with my children in the car with me. But it's gotten to the point where I basically have to put my purse in the back seat of the car, something to physically take the phone away from me, so I know I won't answer it, so I know I won't look at it if I hear the ding go off of a text or something like that. And other than that, I really don't know how else to stop it besides just, you know, committing to not doing it. But, you know, Bill, back to where your area of expertise is, I mean, we all think we're better multitaskers than we really are, no doubt. Is that right?
That's a great point. Everybody thinks they can multitask, but virtually nobody can. And I think that's something that's described quite well in the movie, actually. There's new work with brain scanning, looking at what's happening in different parts of the brain during different complex tasks. And it basically shows what we've thought for a while, that you really can't actively multitask. I think getting back to a point that Chris made earlier, with this impulse control about not responding to a ding or something like that, that's actually more difficult as a youngster. I mean, this is when we talked about areas of the brain that are not fully online yet. That includes areas of the front of the brain that are involved in decision making, executive control. And so deciding whether or not it's okay to respond to something is something that is, again, a little harder as a youngster than as an adult who's gone through a lot of training and a lot of reinforcement.
Yeah, that's a great point too, that impulse control. Well, we are going to take a quick break, but stay with us because we'll be right back to talk more about some of the solutions, what you can do to stop yourself and your kids from texting and driving, and how we can all get involved with making our roads a little safer. Stay with us. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us this morning for a very important topic. More than 3,000 teenagers die every year in crashes caused by texting and driving. That's over 300 more than the number of teens killed in drunk driving accidents. And once again, I am joined by Chris Schuler, the producer of the documentary Driven to Distraction, which will be airing on KOB this week, June 5th. A special program will air the documentary and then follow up with a live program with our Tom Joles and Tessa Mentis, talking about the dangers with experts and kids right here in the studio as well. We also have Dr. Bill Shuttleworth from UNM's Health Sciences Center, a neuroscientist, talking about how the brain of teenagers is still developing and not necessarily equipped to deal with some of the challenges of distracted driving. And of course, none of us really are. All of us have trouble with that. And Bill, I'll start with you. We were talking during the break about a huge issue affecting everyone, but also teenagers. An effect on their brain is sleep deprivation.
Right. I think that's, if you were to pick one thing as a one concrete intervention for all of this, you might start with sleep. And I think Madeline on the documentary spoke very nicely about the impact of sleep on attention and the ability to multitask, or try to multitask at least. And I think she makes a very good point that most kids are sleep deprived. And she made an extra little point that sometimes it's the overachievers, those that are doing a lot of extra activities before school and after school. Their days are getting very long, and they're cramming a lot of things in and averaging about 6.5 hours sleep a night. That's not enough. That's not enough to consolidate these memories, to lay down these tracks of neuronal networks that you need to learn to drive properly and deal with distraction. So not only is there an impairment from lack of sleep, an acute impairment, it delays the ability to consolidate information. So there's two hits to that. So if you were to pick one thing to start with, you would just really encourage really good sleep for everybody, but especially developing teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely. Teenagers get into crashes every year because of just the lack of sleep. Falling asleep behind the wheel is still a problem. Right. And when you add the texting and distracted driving to that,
you're more distractible.
You're more distractible in that
one
case.
Of the things she said in the film too that I thought was really important. It goes by so fast in the film, but it really struck home with me. And she said, when you're sleep deprived, of course, it changes your reaction time. It also changes the amount of time it takes you to refocus. She said if you're looking at your cell phone or something's distracting you off the road or somebody's yelling in the back seat, it takes a little bit of time to come back and see what's in front of you. If you're sleep deprived, she said, it takes much longer to come back and actually see what's in front of you. You know, a half second, a second. Yeah. We know how quick accidents happen. Yeah. So that's a huge deal. Huge deal. Any
little amount is going to affect that. We were talking a little bit about the solutions to this and how we can start coming up with ideas. I mentioned, you know, I throw my purse in the back seat of my car to make sure I won't grab my phone. But what about technology? Are there apps that will disable the phones? Any cars that will do that for you?
There are now apps, and we've Googled them all, and you look at them, or you go in the App Store and you find them. You may have found some too, but there are a number of them. They're very inexpensive. Some of them have anytime your phone is moving in the car, it'll turn off. Some of them, which I think are really cool, and I've actually experienced one of these. If somebody calls you while you're driving, your phone will answer and say, I'm sorry, Nicole's driving now, she can't answer the phone, which I think is great.
It reminds them too,
and I think if our focus in the show is take care of each other. If you love someone, if you care about someone, you don't want them in a wreck, then don't call them while they're driving, and encourage them not to use their phone while they're driving. It's so hard to do that. It's so hard not to, when the phone, even if you have it on vibrate, you kind of want to look and see who it was to see if you should answer. So you've got to make a decision, as Dr. David Strayer says in the film, you need to make a decision before you drive. You need to say, when I do business, I'm going to turn my phone off. I'm not going to answer it in the car, and you throw it in your purse or you throw it in the back or do whatever you have to do. But decide, okay, during that time period, I'm not going to do it. The other thing we encourage kids and adults to think about is, okay, if you were an fender bender, not even in a huge crash, no kids believe they're ever going to die. But they do believe, okay, I can be in a fender bender, it'll affect my insurance, it'll affect whatever. I could, you know, a lot of my friends have been in a fender bender.
They're aware of that,
If you were in a fender bender, how long is it going to take to deal with? And how much money is it going to cost you? Is it worth seeing that text? Is it worth answering the phone? Is it worth the extra 10 minutes to get to a location where you can actually answer the phone? And I think as adults, one of the solutions that I found, this is horrible, don't tell anybody this, but what I do is, I think if I don't answer the phone for my business, people think I'm busy. That's probably good for the business. They think I'm really important. I don't have enough time to answer. And so I think of it that way. That's how I sort of justify, okay, I'm going to turn the phone off. You know, and it's you got to do that. You really have to do that. It's just not worth it.
Yeah, you're right. There's this expectation these days, I think, culturally, that we're all going to be available at all times, always connected. And that has to change. All of us sort of have to accept that's not always going to be the case.
That's exactly right. That's our next show, actually. That we're doing in August.
Yeah, a little sneak preview. We'll definitely have you back on.
But it's all about the digital age. The fact that we're digital immigrants and kids are digital natives. And now they are. It's a constant connection. But it applies to this too. I mean, we all think that it's so important. And it's actually not important anymore. It's just an ongoing thing. You know, an update, a Facebook update, a text, a Twitter, a thing, whatever. And it's like anytime that thing buzzes, we got to check to see what's going on.
And even just the buzz, even if you don't respond to it, just the ding,
hearing it.
Just that will cause a lot of brain activation and actually detract from your ability to handle distractions. Just the ding.
Yeah.
So I think your point about turning it off to silent is actually pretty important.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, and that's a good, you know, brings us back to the question. I mean, we talk a lot about texting and driving because teenagers communicate a lot by texts and Facebook, Twitter, all the things you can do with a phone. But really just talking on cell phones and driving, if we look back a few years, the newest laws that were coming out were about banning holding your cell phone while driving. We were talking about you have to use a headset, etc. Are any of these good? I mean, that still can be a distracting, just having a conversation on a phone. Is that right?
I think that's the very interesting stuff, which we don't fully understand the neurological basis of this. But generally, if you listen to the radio, you can actually do quite well listening to the car radio. But adding on a conversation, a two-way conversation on cell phones, very different activation of brain regions, and much more distributed activity, involves much more of the areas that are responsible for attention. So it's a very different activity, which I found surprising initially. I thought, you know, talking to someone sitting next to you in the car, which we all do, and that's obviously fine, but actually having a conversation with someone who's not there requires different parts of your brain to create the image of the person, because they're not actually there, so you're having to do that virtually. So you're actually using different regions of the brain to have a conversation with someone who isn't there than with someone who is there. And that's a big deal for distraction.
And the person who is there, of course, has vested interest in you driving safe.
Right, so something happens,
see what's going on.
They can stop talking.
That's true.
The person on the other end of the phone has no idea what's happening in the car. Great point.
That is a great point.
And hands-free and handheld, identical impairment. And in terms of from Strayer's research, which is crazy, because all the laws that have been passed, people think, oh, then I mean the assumption is it's safer.
Yes.
It's okay then. It's not okay.
Yeah.
It's not really about the hands. It's about what's happening up here.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, it's like you pointed out. I mean, we've gotten to a point culturally where most of us would not drive with a beer in our hands.
Of course.
That would be unacceptable, even if you're not drunk. You wouldn't drive with a beer in your hand. And we have to get to the point where it would be just as socially unacceptable to be seen with a phone in your hand or talking to someone who's not there.
That's exactly right. As you're driving down, I was driving down Paseo on the way down here, and I looked, and there's somebody in front, and they were swerving a little bit. And I thought, okay, you know, it's a Sunday. Nobody's drinking this early in the morning.
Yeah.
It's TWD, texting while driving.
There it is.
TWI.
There it is. Yeah, good. Oh, that's exactly right. It's scary stuff.
So, are by having kids telling kids not to do this, getting them involved, is that a solution?
Yeah, they're coming up with, on the Facebook page, which folks should go to, it's really interesting, and it'll be an ongoing conversation there, and on the Twitter thing, NM Distraction. NM Distraction, yeah, that's it. The kids are coming up with ideas, and they're coming up with good ideas, I think. One of them was, I thought it was just great, they said, you should have a designated texter. It's like a designated driver. Have a designated texter. If you got a text, hand your phone to your buddy who's in the car and do the thing. Now, what's interesting is that kids, if there's an extra kid in the car, it doubles the chance of a crash.
Right.
If there's an extra kid beyond that, it goes up again. So, and the reason is, I think you mentioned it in the show, or does Andy mention, that you hear the kid yelling and screaming in the back, or everybody screaming and yelling together. Your brain has to make a decision. Prioritization occurs. Is that more important, or is the truck over there more important? That's more important in the brain of a kid. And so they don't pay attention to the truck over there, which is the big problem. But I thought the designated texter idea was an interesting one.
Hey, it's something that gets it out of their hands. Any other ideas coming up?
I mean, taking care of your friends, that's the big push for us. It's like, you know, I care about you, I care about Bill.
Right.
Don't do this. I mean, don't do this. It's just not smart. And you got to help me not to do it. You've really got to, especially for kids, they're very peer influenced. And I think if they help each other and they do it because, listen, I care about you, I don't want you to do this, then
I like
that's
that, and I like that emotional aspect of it. You know, would you want to be the driver who crashes and kills the friends in your car? No, no one would want that. And if you know they care about each other and tap into that, that could be powerful. Well, we're running out of time here. About a minute left. What else would you guys like to say about the upcoming documentary?
I was shocked by it. I mean, I thought I knew a fair bit about distracted driving, and I learned a great deal, and I was shocked, and my driving has changed because of it. It made a big impact on me and my family.
Very good pitch for that to watch
good
it
to
this
hear.
week.
Yeah, no, it
Absolutely.
seriously did.
Made a change. All right. Well, we want to remind you we'll be showing that documentary right here on KOB, Driven to Distraction. That airs Thursday, June 5th, this Thursday, 7 p.m. The documentary and then a live program in our studio with experts, parents, teenagers. We all are part of ending this problem. And thank you, Chris Schuler, for producing this documentary and coming on to talk
Thanks
about
to
it.
KOB for airing it. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you, Bill.
Great.
And we'll see you next week for another Eye on New Mexico.